Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Curiosity Monkey podcast. So, lately, the sea around Cornwall, where I live, has been quite green, much greener than usual. Quite strange, actually. You don't usually see it this green for such prolonged periods of time. So, I guess the question is, what is causing this? So there are several conditions that are required for this to happen, and in this episode we'll try to explore some of the mechanisms that may be at play for this to occur, because there's some interesting physics going on here that is allowing this to occur, and there are several conditions that have to be met at the same time to see this, and that's why it's quite rare. So the question is, what is going on? And first things first, this greening is very, very characteristic of phytoplankton bloom. And indeed, that is the cause of the greening. So phytoplanktons are a subset of planktons, planktons being organisms that live in water but kind of drift with the flow, and they're usually small, such as bacteria, algae, protists, fungi, some smaller animals. And phytoplankton are the subset of planktons that use energy from the sun, so light or UV photons, and convert carbon dioxide into organic compounds such as sugars, which they use for energy. And obviously they are photosynthetic, so they must live where the light is, so the surface waters of the ocean. So here we have a plot of so this is Cornwall, potentially obviously, and these are the concentration of chlorophyll in the surface waters. So chlorophyll being one of the absorbing compounds required for photosynthesis in photosynthetic organisms, so autotrophic organisms, and the red areas represent regions of much higher chlorophyll concentration, representing where there is phytoplankton. So you can see around the coast, there are little patches here where very high concentrations, much higher than usual. And so, yeah, there's obviously a lot of phytoplankton, and that is what's causing this greening here. It's not the best photo, but yeah, very, very green. If you're in the water, you can't really see very far. Not clear like it usually is. So this is due to planktons. And phytoplankton are pretty cool. They produce around 50% of the world's oxygen, and they only account for around 1% of the biomass. So they're very, very efficient at producing oxygen, because not many of them produce a lot of the world's oxygen. And of course, not all phytoplankton are the same, because they are basically loads and loads of different species that make it up. And so the composition can change. And however, they all do contain the chlorophylls, which gives it this distinct green colour, and so we can detect it through remote sensing. So this is satellite images. This one's taken from NASA Worldview, plus the overlay of the chlorophyll concentration. But the question is, which we're going to try and answer in this episode today, why is there all this phytoplankton growth? Because it's not usually this green for this long. The phytoplanktons don't usually bloom this much and for this long. So what is going on here that allows this to occur? Like, obviously the conditions for phytoplankton growth and bloom are there. The conditions that the plankton like to grow and reproduce, and so we see this increase in number. So what are these conditions that are allowing this to happen? One key point I'll mention before we look at that is phytoplanktons, unlike other photosynthetic organisms like trees, for instance, or other plants, respond very, very quickly to changes in conditions. They have a high turnover rate, so they can reproduce very quickly. And so if the conditions are good for them, for just a few days, you will see a massive growth. Unlike a tree, if it has really, really good conditions for a few days, you're not going to see a ton of growth because it's very slow to grow. They don't just reproduce like that. So one reason we can see these blooms very quickly, they come in and then they come out, is because they're very, very responsive to small changes in conditions. So the first clue that we have here is the first portion of April, so the first 10 days, were very sunny, very clear, not a lot of clouds in the sky. So you have the sustained sunlight, and obviously because these are phytoplanktons, they're photosynthetic organisms that require sunlight to undergo photosynthesis. So in order to fix carbon dioxide into sugars, then you need the sun. The sun is one of the requirements for the bloom. And so this is actually another satellite image taken from NASA Worldview, looking at the region over Cornwall, and there are no clouds in the sky here. I can't remember the exact date here, but it's probably, I think it was around the 8th of April this was taken. No clouds in the sky, very, very clear, and that is the overall trend. I'll try and show a little time lapse of the basically how cloudy it was over the first 11 days of April, and most of those days were very, very clear, no clouds at all. Some of those days just a few clouds in the sky, but it's actually very rare that here in Cornwall that you see sustained sunlight for that long. So that's one of the factors why this bloom occurred. Next, nutrients. Now, carbon dioxide is not the only chemical species required for growth of these organisms and for phytoplanktons to survive. Think species are not just made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So us, we're not just made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. A lot of us, a lot of our mass is that, but there's other chemicals involved. So you've got nitrogen to form proteins and nucleic acids from DNA, phosphorus for ATP, which is one of the energy, commonly known as the energy currencies of our cells, also used in DNA, and phospholipids in our cell membranes. What about metals such as potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, manganese, zinc, cobalt, etc., etc., etc. Iron, manganese, and copper are used to pass electrons in the electron transport chain, just allows photosynthesis, respiration to occur. And so those nutrients, think of when you're using fertilizer to grow crops. It's the same thing here. These phytoplanktons need these nutrients in order to grow, to reproduce. And since it has been sunny before in Cornwall for this long and it hasn't bloomed just like this, it means there must be more nutrients in the water than usual. And the question is really, where are these nutrients coming from? And one possibility is obviously runoff. Say the fertilizers used to grow crops. Often these fertilizers can run off into the rivers and then make their way into the ocean. And it's indeed very common for this to occur. We made an episode a while back on sewage treatment, and one of the things in sewage, which is a lot of that sewage is just runoff from fields, is fertilizer. And you can see the effects of fertilizer in rivers. Fertilizer-rich rivers bloom with algae all the time and different phytoplanktons all the time, and they have that clouded green appearance. But it hasn't been raining. It's been clear, it's been sunny for the last 2 weeks or so, and so there hasn't been any rain really to flush that fertilizers off the fields, into the rivers, into the ocean. So it's unlikely that this is the cause really of this increase in nutrients. Sure, there might be some fertilizer from the fields in the ocean from that, but it's unlikely to be the main cause. The other one, which we will find to be the culprit here for this increase in nutrients later on, is upwelling. So if you think in the surface waters, a lot of life is. So you've got the phytoplanktons, different fish feed off those phytoplanktons, and then the food chain will continue, so other fish will eat those fish. So a lot of the food chain and energy exchange occurs in the upper layers of the ocean. And so when those animals die, a lot of that energy, carbon and nutrients fall down to the lower regions of the ocean. So they sink. Over time they will decay and release their nutrients back into the waters. But upwelling is basically the process where deeper waters rise up and replace surface waters. And so those nutrient-rich, deeper waters will rise and replace the surface waters and allow any organisms up in the upper layers of the ocean to use those nutrients. And we'll find in a second that this is what's causing this increase in phytoplanktons. And this brings us to the next part of the episode, which I think is the most exciting bit and the reason I made this episode, and that is Ekman transport. So Ekman transport is quite a cool phenomenon that really is explaining how our nutrients are getting transported to the surface waters for our algal blooms and phytoplankton blooms. So it comes quite nicely shown from the theory, so apologies if you do not like some maths, but I'll make it fairly simple so you can follow along nonetheless. So if you've dealt with fluid dynamics before, you'll no doubt have seen the Navier-Stokes equations. So here we begin with the Navier-Stokes equations for a fluid in a rotating frame, where here u is the velocity vector, f is the Coriolis parameter, which varies with latitude. That's being that little theta there is the latitude. Theta equals 0 is the equator. Theta equals 90 degrees is the poles, well, the North Pole. And g is the gravitational vector, so yeah, just as usual. And here we assume that the x direction is from east to west, or west to east, whatever, and y is the latitude, so north-south. Z is the depth. And so we can assume a steady flow, so no time dependence, and we'll also assume a small Reynolds number, so quite slow flow. And here that means we can get rid of this derivative of u and also this u dot grad u term, advection term. So we are left with some simplified equations here with this Coriolis term, pressure term, the viscous term here, gravitational term as well. And so we can assume something called geostrophic balance, which is where the geostrophic current is balancing the pressure term. And this is just allows us to get rid of this pressure term in the equation. And we can also assume that the shear stress here, tau, is related to the velocity gradients in z. And so we can simplify our equations further, and we're left with something nicely in the x and y components. So the x component being west to east, and the y component being south to north, whatever. So yeah, we're left with these components, and we also note that the velocity is just a function of z, so function of the depth. So the velocity changes with the depth of the fluid. And our fluid here is the ocean. Now, by integrating our velocities by z, u being the velocity from the longitudinal velocity, so velocity from east to west, for instance, and v being the latitudinal velocity, so north to south velocity, and integrating between, we're assuming a depth, the ocean's infinitely deep, so no boundary at the bottom, and then up to the surface of the ocean, which we're assuming is z equals 0. So now we can simply substitute our u and v values from here. So we have our components here. We can substitute that into our integral and then simply integrate. We apply our wind stress on the boundary, so we have some wind stress. So imagine you've got some wind blowing over the ocean, and there's friction between that wind and the surface of the ocean, and that's the directional stress. So if you have wind blowing from south to north, then you're applying stress in the south to north direction on the ocean. And that's what this towel represents. And the result is mass transport is perpendicular to the wind stress. So perpendicular being 90 degrees. So if you have a wind blowing from north to south in the northern hemisphere, because that value of F changes in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. If in the south, it's the negative of what it is in the north. So if the wind is blowing from north to south, then the water moves from east to west. You would probably expect that if the wind was blowing and that stress was being applied on the surface in the direction that the wind was blowing, that the water or the mass transport would be net in the direction of the wind blowing. But due to this Coriolis effect, it's actually perpendicular. So how does this help us in this case? Well, it turns out for a lot of the start of April, there was a northeasterly wind. So that's a wind coming from the northeast and blowing parallel to the coast. So parallel to this north coast here, and blowing consistently over the start of April. And so it's heading southwest, essentially. And this is from some day at the start of April, the 8th actually, and you can see those streamlines, just the velocity is parallel to the coast. And so using our quite nicely derived theorem, using some of our assumptions from earlier, that the wind is blowing straight down the coast, and so our mass transport is perpendicular to this to the right. So the mass transport is out to sea. So what we get from this is that seawater is getting surface seawater is getting transported out to sea, and this is driven by wind. So our quick note here is wind really does play a very crucial role in driving surface ocean currents. So one of our episodes a while back was on some gyres, which are the big ocean gyres around the basin. So one of them is causing basically the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, where large rotational flows in the ocean, in the surface ocean, allow plastic waste build up in the center. And so wind drives those large scale ocean circulations. So here we have our surface water being pushed directly out to sea. But water obviously doesn't just vanish like this. We have to maintain the height. So it is replenished. And deeper water will rise from below to fill the void and will bring it all the nutrients it contains. And this water is often quite cold, so sometimes you'll notice that the water may fluctuate in temperature because of this. And that is essentially why we've seen this algal blooming. So you've got the wind causing the transport of surface waters perpendicular to the shear stress. So the shear stress was acting parallel to the coast, but the mass transport of water was perpendicular out to sea. So surface waters moving out to sea. Deeper waters would come in and replace that surface water, bringing nutrients with it. That, combined with prolonged sunlight with the nutrients, allowed photosynthetic organisms such as the planktons, the phytoplanktons, to proliferate, grow, multiply, and essentially that is why you've seen this greening. So the reason I made this episode is this quite basic derivation we did here. We started with very general equation for fluid flow. We made some assumptions, just a few assumptions which allowed us to simplify the problem massively. And we ended up with a very, very simple, nice little equation that tells us that the mass transport is perpendicular to the shear stress. And so from just a little bit of quite simple theory, we can relate it to real life phenomenons that we are seeing right now. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Curiosity Monkey podcast. If you have any episode suggestions or feedback, do not hesitate to contact us at thecuriositymonkey1@gmail.com, or we're also on Instagram at thecuriositymonkey. So yeah, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.